Hello there, listeners of the Bylines Network podcast. Welcome to Chris and Julian Explain the World. I'm Julian in Bristol.
And I'm Chris in London.
So I thought we'd start off with the news coming out of Germany. It looks like Angela Merkel 2.0 is going to be Chancellor of Germany.
I mean, that wasn't my takeaway. My takeaway from the German elections is more their fascinating sort of firewall tactic to block any sort of far-right party from government, which I didn't actually realise was kind of a thing before.
Given their history, we had full support. One of the reasons why the funny moustached man rose to power was because no one took him seriously and decided to work with him. And it's, look, the brown shirts are marching on the Reichstag. Okay.
I mean, if they didn't have, it would make more sense for the CDU to go into coalition with the AfD because the numbers match up, like percentage-wise, in terms of how their government's formed, like in the Bundestag. But obviously, that's not going to happen. And I mean, it's completely opposite of here, where you'd have, presumably, if we had a coalition government at the next election, you'd look at potentially if the Tories in Reform could make up. There's a bit of foreshadowing here. If the Tories in Reform can make up a majority in Parliament, they'd do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why, like, the Liberal Democrats teaming up with the Conservatives back in 2010 was like such a surprise, because they weren't their natural allies. That we've always ever seen, like, Labour and the Liberal Democrats team up. But a so-called firewall is not necessarily unique to Germany. After the South African elections last year, there was a 5-party coalition made up to effectively shut the South African version to Boris Johnson out. See, and they were all just like, okay, we're the biggest ones. We're not going to let that disaster back in. Team up, even though we all hate each other. You made so far of the leader of the CDU?
At least he's not far right.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd be a lot more confident if he hadn't, like, teamed up with the AfD last year.
At least they're not going into government together, so that's positive. And I mean, the positive thing to take from the results is among the youth in Germany, they basically put all of their support behind left-wing parties. There was a Die Linke, and they enjoyed a massive swell of support, Die Linke, from the young people of Germany. So I mean, it's not all lost. We just have to deal with a couple of years of awful centre-right coalition government. And I mean, if anyone has a spare chance, and it sounds really, really dry, but it actually isn't. Like, read the history of how the Bundestag works, which is like the German parliament, and how it's put together and set up, because it is really interesting. But yeah, I mean, we'll go on to this later, I think. But I think, to be honest, the takeaway from the German elections is it should be really a warning shot for any vaguely left-wing government that's in charge at the moment, because there's a pattern emerging, unfortunately.
Well, I don't quite know if it will happen here. There are, like, many different factors to why the left coalition basically fell apart. For one thing, it was a coalition of 3 parties. Number 2, it was a coalition. We don't really have that problem over here, thanks to first past the post. But yes, I do agree that there are some things that do need to be looked into. Like, the left parties didn't really agree on a lot, and that eventually led to their downfall. And one of the main reasons why I think the AfD have risen to power is it's the old price of eggs problem that I'm now coining. They didn't really do a lot to fix the problems of the average German. And we're going right back to our discussion after the election of saying the vibes were off.
Like, I mean, maybe the takeaway you could also have from this is, that in the German parliament, the AfD will be the second largest party, which means they'll have a bigger voice than they ever have. And maybe that means more people will start listening to them, because it's very easy to criticize when you're in opposition. Like, it's very easy to make things sound better if you'd chosen the other guy. It's very easy to say, well, actually, we would have done X, and you're not in power. You don't have any control, actually. So just even them having that platform is just a bit shocking and scary.
It does also seem like the guy, Merz, he does seem to be starting to take that. I mean, because one of the first things he said was commenting about the situation in Europe and the situation with the annoying orange from across the pond. He does seem to be, like, taking that natural leader of Europe position again that Macron's been trying to take from Germany for the past 5 years and failing.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the first things he said was basically he wants to build up Germany to make sure that they're independent of, well, they're able to stand on their own 2 feet more or less, but also said, we shouldn't need America and Europe shouldn't need America. I didn't follow the campaign too closely, despite my vague and very minimal understanding of German as in the language. So it probably would have been easier for me to follow it than not. But it would have been interesting to see whether that would have been the case. Would the Big Orange have been elected as president? I mean, the reality is you've got the Labour government now talking about increasing defence spending, and so I don't know if that's in isolation, but I mean, all round it's fascinating. Even it's separate from the German election. Everything that's going on at the minute is a bit wild.
Well, on to the next story then. We're going to be talking about polls today, listeners, and this very strange habit that I have been seeing amongst left-leaning people. So I've been seeing like poll after poll showing like the rise of Nigel Farage, and it came to a head like last week at time of recording, where there was a poll that came out that put Nigel Farage's Reform Party ahead of Labour and ahead of the Conservatives, and they also put the Conservatives ahead of Labour. Running around like headless chick. It was like that scene in Chicken Run. It's just like we mustn't panic. We mustn't panic.
But I mean, Politico on their website, their poll of polls also has Reform on top, 2 points ahead of Labour, and I think that takes like an average of different polls. So it's not like it's just one singular.
I'm not saying it's like an outlier. I've seen it on like 2 polls, but I kind of feel like we're missing the woods for the trees when it comes to these things. Like, how can we, in this post 2016 Brexit world, any trust in polls? Like, it's been like a bit headache inducing. Like 2016 Brexit comes along, everyone thinks that it's in the bag because the polls say so. Everyone thinks that Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president of the United States because the polls say so. And, everyone thought that Donald Trump was going to win the 2020 election because the polls said so. Admittedly, they did also say that Boris Johnson would win the 2019 election. But, I feel like I could have seen that coming a mile off. Polls don't work the way people think they do. It's like Rotten Tomatoes works for how people, say, oh, this film got 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. That must mean it's good. It's like, no, 89% of critics say it's good. It doesn't work like that, guys.
Oh no, I kind of feel bad now because I always look at the Rotten Tomatoes score before I watch a movie, and I always thought that meant 89% of people think it's great.
No.
Oh well, I'll read those reviews with a bit more with a bit more care next time. What I in doing in a bit of background research, I was thinking, well, we've had, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, we've had attempts at the creation of third parties, I suppose, in terms of sort of on the right third parties like UKIP and the Brexit Party, and now we've got Reform. And I looked back at polling data for UKIP and the Brexit Party. I don't think either of them ever got to the level that Reform is now. But with a disclaimer, third parties don't do well in elections up until fairly recently. So like July 2024 was a different ball game. Obviously the Greens did very well, the Lib Dems did very well, and Reform also did quite well. In British politics, because of the first past the post system, third parties don't tend to do too well because you have people who, say at a local election might vote for a smaller party like Reform, but when it comes to a general election, if they're in a seat where it's a race between 2 candidates, you consolidate behind the one who's most likely to win, linked to your values. So, if you're a floaty Reform voter, you back Tory usually. In historical terms, in historical presumption, that's what you do. You're probably going to disagree with me, but I don't actually think that the I don't necessarily think that Reform will ever form a government at all. But I don't think that. I think this might be the beginning, not of the end, but of certainly a different iteration of the two-party system that we see. Because I think people are more. Well, I mean, just look at the last election results. This is the most sort of mixed parliament we've had in a very, very long time. Um, and when you've got a Labour government with a massive majority, they can only go down from there. They can't go up.
I mean, I don't think Nigel Farage is ever going to form a government either. I don't think they're even going to form into like a coalition or anything with the Conservatives because I don't ever see the Conservatives ever getting like the numbers that they used to get. Not at least for another 15 years. I mean, who's to say what the Conservatives will look like in the next 5 years? I don't think Kemi Badenoch's going to be in charge, and it's going to be a massive forth in their party about whether or not to just hand the keys over to Nigel Farage. And I don't think that's going to happen because the big secret about the Conservative Party is they are one of the single most successful political parties in the world. I think only their Conservative colleagues in Japan can boast the same kind of numbers amongst the same kind of period. Because over the last 200 odd years, I think it's a fairly safe bet to say that the Conservatives have been in power for about 125 of them. And you don't survive that long by just giving the keys to the gates over to some like random guy who, yeah, is doing quite well in some of the polls, but that doesn't necessarily translate. People keep forgetting that the exit polls on last year's election had the Reform Party winning 13 seats, and they just about won five. I think one of the biggest reasons why everyone's making such a big fuss about Reform is because they're going after the same voter base that would traditionally vote Conservative, and the Conservatives are one of the most successful political parties in the world. But that doesn't mean anything. You know, we're not in like the last year of a term for the current governments. We haven't even passed like the first year mark. I've always said, unless things go catastrophically wrong, and I do mean, oh God, the Prime Minister is breaking his own rules kind of wrong, it don't matter.
But and I mean, picking up on the fact that you've quite rightly raised in that the Conservative Party is the most successful political party that exists in British politics, right, and has done for generations. Um, do you? I mean, looking at the electoral map of the country now, and a big part of the reason the Tories lost the election in July is because Reform stood in so many seats. Thinking how the Conservative Party are the best at winning elections and in theory strategizing and going, how do we survive, how do we keep going, how do we win, because they're ruthless in that. What is to actually, at some point, if Reform maintain the momentum, the Conservatives won't ever win a majority again, in theory.
Certainly a good time, Chris.
No, but why would they, if they are, this machine, this electoral machine, and they're as good as we think they are, because they've obviously governed, they've had governments for most of our lifetime and most of the UK's existence. What's to stop them from going, well, we're just going to be obliterated if we don't do this, and we'll never hold power again, unless we do something like deal with them, or the other alternative is shift further to the right. But at the same time, I think Reform is too far gone now to say, what the Brexit Party did in 2019, which is, we're not going to stand anyone because Boris Johnson is, we want him to win. That's never going to happen. Reform won't ever do that to the Conservatives, because they're, part of the reason they did so well is because people didn't think the Tories did a good enough job. There's entirely the potential that they'll just merge at some stage, but that's unlikely because Nigel Farage doesn't like the Conservatives very much. So, like I say, there's something has to be done if, in theory, they're the best electoral force in the country and they know what they're doing and they want to win. Like, they have to come to some sort of agreement, because otherwise it's oblivion for them. They'll never have government again.
But my problem with the polls is that there was this sketch by College Humor made a while ago that was called "If Google Was a Person." It was very funny, and there was a moment in it where a lady is talking to this guy who obviously is meant to be representing Google and goes, show me evidence that vaccines cause autism. And the guy goes, okay, here is 99,999 cases proving not, and here's the one case that does. Thank you. I knew it. That's what polls are to me. They're vindications of a specific viewpoint. For every poll that you can show, like Reform leapfrogging Labour, I can find another one that just has them leapfrogging the Conservatives. I currently have on my screen in front polling done by YouGov that shows Keir Starmer beating all of the other leaders in terms of who do you think would be the best prime minister. He beats Kemi Badenoch 31-20. He beats Nigel Farage 36-26. He beats Ed Davey 24-16. And even Ed Davey beats Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch. The only one where it's a tight race is Kemi Badenoch versus Nigel Farage at 22 each. Admittedly, this does come from the beginning of the month, so this might have changed by now. But that's just another thing with the polls.
A lot of the research that in the polls, I think that you might have seen in well, certainly in the things that I've read, there's a lot of breakdown between actually how many Tory voters are there that would go to Reform, and the concerning one out of general voters was 10% of voters see the Tories as strong, but 61% see them as weak. But Reform, obviously, amongst most people, was seen as stronger than that, despite them having less MPs and less clout in Parliament. Most people don't think that way, but that's fine. But 56% of people in this poll that I think lots of people got into a bit of a fuss about were saying that they would definitely not vote for Reform, but that meant 44% would. So in theory, that means only 44% of the electorate would consider voting Reform. That's still enough to form a government if, in theory, they decided to do that.
Yeah, but at the same time, that's still 56% of people wouldn't. 56% of people, if it's spread amongst like the left-wing parties, they would do what they're doing in Germany right now. Do a super bloc to make sure they don't get into parliaments. One of the polls that I saw of Labour getting leapfrogged by Reform UK was a poll that was taken in like a few Labour constituencies where Reform came second. And right now, Labour's strategy of do the unpopular things in the first year is doing exactly what it says on the tin. They're doing the unpopular things in the first year. So, of course, people are going to be discontented from them. So if you go to places where Reform came second, what do you think's going to happen? What polling do you think you're going to get?
But I mean, interestingly on that, and I mean, this is just news from today, that the day of recording is the 24th of February. We had Mike Amesbury get his sentence from court for punching somebody outside of a pub. And that is one of the seats that you mentioned where Reform have come second. There's the fairly, not impossible, but likelihood that there will be a by-election. And it's not impossible Reform will win that because, like you say, we're in the period of Labour are doing the unpopular things. People there won't be happy, so they might vote for Reform instead. If that happens, the narrative around Reform will be completely different. But again, cast your minds back to when UKIP won by-elections. Oh, wait. I think they won one. So, I mean, the narrative will be exactly around like it was, I think it was marked reckless. Like, the narrative at that time when UKIP won that by-election years ago was like, oh my God, they're on the march, they're doing really well. And then what happened? They just, faded into insignificance.
Remember a party called the British National Party, or as I like to call it, the reason why we can't shorten this to the BNP.
Oh my God, yeah, that's so true.
So before this year, Reform have never hit 25% of the polling, but the BNP almost certainly have. The BNP definitely hit 25%. I know that for a fact. I remember Nick Griffin being everywhere. He was on Question Time. He did a very hilarious interview with, I believe, Sky News, where he claimed there was no such thing as a black Welshman. I honestly think that 25-26% is the ceiling for these kind of parties. And that's when they have a very controversial figure as their head. Because remember, Reform UK are only doing this well because they have a giant personality at the center of all this. And given his association with the annoying orange across the pond, very unpopular figures in this country, that I can honestly see that falling. I once heard Nigel Farage described as the Jeremy Corbyn of the far right. But honestly, it just makes so much sense. Like, he's beloved by some, he's toxic to many. For that reason, Jeremy Corbyn's numbers never raised much beyond 28%.
I mean, but in a way, Nigel Farage is different. Um, I think he's put himself out there throughout the years far more, I think, than Jeremy Corbyn ever did as an individual. That's what I mean as an individual. I think the aim was, people there was a cult of personality big time. But when you think of the Labour Party, generally you don't. Okay, most people will think of the leader if you're aware of who the leader is, but most people just think, okay, Labour Party, whatever. But with like UKIP and the Brexit Party and Reform, Nigel Farage is a huge name. I think most people across the country will know who he is, regardless if they know who their local MP is. They probably won't know who their local MP is. They probably know who Nigel Farage is because he's doing what Nick Griffith used to do, which is go on Question Time every other week. Um, you know, go on. He's got his own show on GB News. He's got that. He's had that profile, and that's been maintained through his various guises and various political parties over many years. He has that platform. I think until he's like entirely and forcefully rejected, I can't see a world in where he'll just disappear quietly and go away. And I think that he's the driving force behind their success genuinely, like him or hate him, which I think our feelings on him are pretty clear. He is a personality like the orange over the other side of the Atlantic. That's where he garners his support. People go out for reform because they want Nigel Farage because he's the face of it, not Lee Anderson as much.
I'm not trying to downsize the threat that Nigel Farage is to this country, because I do think that we should take him very, very seriously. He's a very charismatic man who obviously has, for some reason, given out that personality of, oh, I'm just like a guy that you can get a pint with down at the pub. He's got the same charisma and he's got the same talent in front of a camera that Boris Johnson. That's why these people are popular. I'm just saying, take these polls with a grain of salt, you know, because the same logic that works for these polls is the same science behind weather forecasts. They take a very small minority and then they blow it up against the rest of the country. And the weather forecast is almost always wrong, you know?
Yeah, that's actually quite a good comparison. Like you get during the winter those like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express are like massive
We're running
blizzard.
out of salt.
Yeah, yeah. Like, they go like massive blizzard going to, snowing grannies in North London. It's like, hang on a minute. There's one computer model that suggests that that's a scenario out of like 30 that say that say otherwise. Um, you're right. But again, like the context is important. Um, I think the international context is important. I think more broadly, the world is shifting right, sadly. But again, it comes down to the fact that historically, parties like Reform don't win government and also don't do well during when elections come around because we have a two-party system, whether you like it or not.
I've been saying for like a while, I can honestly see us being under Labour for 10 years. No matter what happens in these 5 years, 171 or whatever it is now is too big a majority to overthrow in one big go. At worst, what I think is going to happen is we're going to get like a left coalition between the Libs and the Labs. And that's the worst case scenario to me. We're still in, I know it's very typical for people to say this, but we are still in the first year, and Labour are intentionally doing unpopular things now because when the next election comes in 2029, who the hell's going to remember 2025? The only reason why I can remember what happened in 2020 is because that was the most cursed of years.
I mean, one thing to remember about the majority that Labour have, whilst it's big, the makeup of the seats that they gained and a lot of their majorities are quite slim. I say slim, but the seats that were won for the first time could quite easily flip the other way. And so, you know, I agree with you, but I think losing in 5 years' time would be the result of a monumental screw up.
And again, I am talking. What the hell do you mean they ordered wine cabinets to Downing Street in the middle of a lockdown?
Yeah,
Catastrophic.
yeah, or you know, crash the economy because you give tax cuts and you know cause people to lose their homes. Kind of massive screw up.
Or had a massive party where, while images of the Queen mourning the death of her husband alone in a church circulated around the media. That probably won't backfire. Sorry, what were you
Yeah,
talking about?
I mean, there's many reasons why, you know, bar the what's happened so far, people could switch off from Labour until 2029. There could be international factors like what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, and you know, people. There's a discussion about putting UK troops in Ukraine. I think a majority of people would support that, but
Hmm,
you know, as a the country have this country has a weird sort of vibe when it comes to intervening militarily. So that could, you know, if that happens, it could influence people's feelings. I think because it's Ukraine and because of the horrific situation that they found themselves in, it would be supported. But equally, we don't. I mean, we don't know what's going to. If there is a peace deal in Ukraine that the UK is involved in, and there's an incident or something, that could backfire. There could be another global financial crisis for all we know. Um,
don't jinx it.
it's impossible to predict. But you're right. I think it would be ridiculous for Labour to lose the next election. But at the same time, unless the polls start shifting the other way, like give it a year. No, no, give it 2 years.
Give it three. Like, come back to me in like 2028, 2027, and say, look, the polls are still the same. Then I start panicking. Well, that was our discussion and opinions on polling. Um, I probably came across a bit more anti-polling than I intended, but you know, I think you raised some very interesting points there, Chris. With that said, thank you very much for joining us, listeners. I've been Julian in Bristol.
And I've been Chris in London.
Thank you for joining us on the Bylines Network podcast this month, hosted by me, Julian Greenbank, and Christopher Davis, and it was edited by me, Julian Greenbank. We do hope that you enjoyed the episode and that you'll continue joining us on our exciting adventure on audio this year.
The Bylines Network is powered by you. We have no backing from billionaires or oligarchs, just the kind, generous donations of you, our readers and our listeners. If you haven't already, please consider supporting us. Just go to the website and click donate, or go to our Chuffed page and donate to our crowdfunding campaign to help keep the lights on. Thank you very much,